The sinking of the MV Derbyshire is among the most tragic and spectacular ends to a modern cargo ship. While the disaster has often been forgotten, the destruction of the Derbyshire, the largest British ship ever lost at sea, is one that has fascinated investigators and marine engineers for decades due to the terrifying circumstances under which the vessel foundered, revealing also an endemic design flaw that not only rocked confidence in ships of its own class, but revealed a more widespread concern in cargo vessel design. The Derbyshire was built in 1976 for the Liverpool-based Bibby line, and was one of 6 Ore Bulk Oil, or OBO, combination carriers to be released between 1971 and 1976. As an OBO combination carrier, the bridge class were designed to transport both wet and dry cargo, ranging from oil to iron ore, and had been ordered by the Bibby line as part of their involvement in the wider Seabridge Consortium, which had been founded in 1966 through the combined resources of the Bibby line, the Britain Steamship Company, Horace Clarkson, Silver Line Limited, the Bowring Steamship Company, and Furness Withy. As part of the Seabridge Agreement, each member line agreed to build bulk carriers which would be chartered in the owner's livery to Seabridge Shipping, thus resulting in the bridge class of cargo vessels that would become the face of the consortium. To build the vessels, the Bibby line and Furness Withy turned to the latter's own subsidiary firm, the Furness Shipbuilding Company of Haverton Hill on the River Tees, which had been established in 1917. However, come the mid-1960s, the Furness Shipbuilding Company was in dire straits, as despite a major modernisation of the Haverton Hill shipyard in 1963 to allow for the building of supertankers, only one vessel of this type had been built before orders dried up, leaving the company in a troubling financial situation as they were unable to pay off the outstanding modernisation debt. While it was hoped that the construction of the bridge-class bulk carriers would reverse the company's fortunes, the order came too late for the Furness Shipbuilding Company, and in 1968 the firm was declared bankrupt, resulting in the loss of 3,000 jobs in the Teesside region. However, the remaining assets and shipbuilding facilities at Haverton Hill were purchased at bankruptcy auction by the Tyneside-based Swan Hunter, one of the UK's foremost shipbuilders, which had created many notable vessels since its establishment in 1880, including the Cunard Line's RMS Mauretania, once holder of the Blue Ribbon for fastest transatlantic crossing between 1909 and 1929, the RMS Carpathia, another Cunard Line vessel famous for coming to the aid of the sinking RMS Titanic in April 1912, and the SS Atlantic Conveyor, a merchant navy vessel famously attacked by Argentine Exocet missiles during the opening stages of the Falklands War in 1982. Construction of the first bridge-class vessel, the MV Furness Bridge, began in 1969, the ship being 866 feet long, 144 feet wide, displacing 77,316 gross tons of water, and being able to carry over 100,000 tons of either wet or dry cargo, while being powered by a Burmeister & Wain 8K98FF diesel engine producing 30,400 horsepower and driving a single propeller. Following the launch of the Furness Bridge in 1971, fulfilling the order for Furness Withy, 5 other vessels of the bridge class were delivered on a yearly basis. Tyne Bridge in 1972, built for Hunting & Sons, English Bridge in 1973, built for the Bibby line, Sir John Hunter in 1974, built for the Norwegian shipping line Hilmar Rexton, Sir Alexander Glenn in 1975, also built for Hilmar Rexton, and Liverpool Bridge in 1976, also built for the Bibby line. The Liverpool Bridge, later to become the Derbyshire, differed from her kin through a larger hull extending to 965 feet, giving the vessel a 91,655 gross tonnage and making it the largest ship ever owned by the Bibby line. However, the delivery of the Liverpool Bridge was ill-timed, as during 1976 the global economy was still reeling from the aftermath of the 1973 oil crisis, which meant that contractual freight rates were higher than those prevailing, and Seabridge was forced to agree to those being renegotiated, resulting in the entire consortium becoming a loss-maker for all the lines that were involved in its formation. Following the first line to withdraw from the Seabridge Consortium, Horace Clarkson, in 1976, this began a chain reaction that spread the mounting debts of the firm across the other consortium members, demanding their withdrawal as well, in order to avoid a crippling expense. Therefore, the Bibby line was forced to break away from the consortium in 1977, and the 2 bridge-class bulk carriers that had been built by Swan Hunter, together with the previous Atlantic Bridge, were laid up, each vessel being renamed to highlight the end of the consortium, the Atlantic Bridge, the Liverpool Bridge, and the English Bridge becoming the Dorsetshire, the Derbyshire, and the Worcestershire, respectively. Further headaches came when, due to delays on the construction of a gas processing plant in Saudi Arabia, the line's brand new liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG carrier, later known as the Staffordshire, was laid up immediately after being built, bringing yet more debts that couldn't be repaid. After sitting idle for a year, the Derbyshire underwent a series of sea trials off the Hook of Holland during 1978, but a large explosion ripped through the engine room, killing third engineer Robert Prescott and severely burning electrical engineer Max Bigham, who later died of his injuries. Throughout the remainder of 1978, 7 of the Bibby Line's 22 ships were laid up due to severe cash flow problems and loan repayments on recent new vessels having to be paid, while 5 ships were mortgaged to finance brokers at a cost that exceeded the loan repayments, resulting in a loss of £13.5 million. To try and cut overhead, the Bibby Line chose to sell 4 of its bulk carriers, the Australian Bridge, the Canadian Bridge, the Worcestershire and the Oxfordshire, with the income of these vessels, sold at severely depreciated prices, being used to help pay outstanding loans, which had been rescheduled with the line's banks and the UK government. The Bibby Line also sold its share in the Dart Container Line, a container consortium that the company had inherited following the buyout of the Bristol City Line in 1968, and was formed in conjunction with Sea Maritime Belge and Clark Traffic Services. After being laid up for repairs, but still under the ownership of the Bibby Line, the Derbyshire re-entered traffic in 1979, and began working heavy iron ore shipments between Canada and Japan in order to supply the latter's booming productivity on the global market for electronic goods, vehicles, and other hardware. It was in this capacity that the Derbyshire undertook her final voyage, departing Sept-Îles, in Quebec, with 157,446 tons of iron ore concentrate bound for Kawasaki in Japan. Heading south into the Atlantic, the vessel was too large to pass through the Suez Canal, and thus had to navigate via the Cape of Good Hope and across the Indian Ocean before eventually reaching the South China Sea after a voyage of 16,600 miles and just under 2 months. However, upon reaching the South China Sea, the ship was confronted by Typhoon Orchid, a Category 2 typhoon that was blowing winds in excess of 95 miles an hour and would go on to kill 9 people during its week-long rampage across Japan. 230 miles south of the island of Okinawa, the Derbyshire hove to and prepared to ride out the storm, the complement of the vessel on this fateful journey being 42 crewmen and 2 wives under the command of Captain Geoffrey Underhill, who made the final radio communication at just after 5 p.m. on September 9, 1980, describing the weather and reporting that the ship was enduring strong swells. After this, the MV Derbyshire disappeared from radar with no distress signal, but it wouldn't be until September 13th, when the Bibby Line became concerned that no messages had been received from the vessel in days, that a search and rescue mission was organised. Starting on September 15th, 2 patrol boats and 2 reconnaissance aircraft combed the seas, and soon an oil slick half a mile wide and nearly 2 miles long was found bubbling up from the ocean approximately 40 miles from the Derbyshire's last reported location. Despite continued reports of oil and fuel deposits at various locations across the area, no physical trace of the vessel or its crew were found, and on September 20th all search and rescue operations were terminated. The only remaining piece of the Derbyshire to be found was one of the ship's lifeboats, which was discovered adrift by a Japanese cargo ship 700 miles southwest of the vessel's last reported location, the external damage to the boat clearly indicating it had been torn from its davits with considerable force. The loss of the MV Derbyshire, a 4-year-old bulk carrier that was built to all the modern shipbuilding standards, sent shockwaves across the shipping industry, but it was the bridge class itself, however, that fell under the greatest scrutiny. It had frequently been reported by both crew and engineers working aboard the bridge class that these ships were prone to cracks in the hull plating since their construction, with the Tyne Bridge reported to have developed fractures in the main deck plating during her sea trials, starting at the hatch corners. 18 months after the sinking of the Derbyshire, the Tyne Bridge was again in trouble when it developed a 19-foot deck crack on the starboard side and an 11-foot crack on the port side, just forward of the superstructure at a point known as Frame 65, requiring the vessel to return to port. Following this, sister ships Sir Alexander Glenn and Sir John Hunter, now known as Cassie Kittiwake, were inspected during the summer of 1982, and both were found to have identical problems with the design and workmanship of critical structural members around Frame 65. The inherent defect of the bridge-class bulk carriers was a pair of longitudinal bulkheads, or girders, that ran nearly the entire length of the ship and served as the main strength members, these longitudinals terminating when they reached a transverse bulkhead that marked the end of the line of cargo holds, situated at Frame 65. Aside from a critical weakness caused by the butt welding of the two longitudinals to the transverse bulkhead, the longitudinal bulkheads forward and aft of frame 65, which were meant to be precisely aligned to preserve continuity and maximum hull strength, were misaligned by 25 to 45 millimeters. The overriding issue with regard to the construction of the bridge class was the use of old equipment at Haverton Hill shipyard, which wasn't suited to the precise construction of modern block section bulk carriers. These dangerous design flaws were well known to the workers at the shipyard, who described the ships as death traps, and noted that it was almost impossible to line the sections up correctly, instead using welding rods in the gaps to fill them before they were welded together, while the flush deck had little or no raised forecastle to provide any protection to the number 1 hatch. Regardless of the faults found in the other bridge-class vessels, and despite protests by shipping unions and the families of those lost, no formal investigation into the sinking of the Derbyshire was undertaken by the British government, but this would change following the loss of her sister ship on November 20th, 1986. Former Bibby Line stablemate, English Bridge, which had been renamed to the Kowloon Bridge, was en route from Sept-Îles in Canada to Clydebank near Glasgow with 165,000 tons of iron ore concentrate, when the crew noticed cracks appearing in the vicinity of frame 65, and thus were forced to anchor up in Bantry Bay in the far southwest of Ireland. However, on approach to Bantry Bay, the ship lost her anchor due to stormy conditions and began to run adrift, with the crew forcing the engine full astern to avoid another oil tanker also sheltering in the bay, but in the process damaged her steering gear, thus rendering the ship uncontrollable. After the crew had been rescued by RAF helicopters, the abandoned Kowloon Bridge, now under no command, continued back out to sea with her engine still running full astern, with attempts by a local tugboat to put a crew aboard to stop the ship failing due to the severe weather conditions. Eventually, the errant vessel was turned fully about by the wind and headed back into shore, striking an undersea reef at the entrance to Baltimore Bay approximately 14 miles south, whereupon the propeller was broken and the bulk carrier brought to a halt. In the ensuing storm, though, the ship's back was broken, causing a fuel leak that contaminated large parts of the Irish coast and caused untold ecological damage across the Celtic Sea. In the end, after 6 months of being stranded on the reef, the ruined Kowloon Bridge broke into 3 sections and sank to the bottom in spring of 1987, but the highly publicised loss of the vessel finally brought much-needed attention to both the inherent flaws of the bridge-class bulk carriers and the destruction of the Derbyshire. As the most glaring issue was the defect with frame 65, recommendations were made to either withdraw surviving bridge-class bulk carriers from service or to implement extensive modifications. To this end, only the Tyne Bridge, which demonstrated the most defects in its construction, was withdrawn and scrapped in 1987, while the remaining bridge-class vessels were modified and continued to sea work into the 1990s, the last of the line, the former Sir John Hunter, being broken up in 1997. The enduring mystery, though, was the loss of the Derbyshire, as questions remained unanswered as to the circumstances under which the vessel sank. Although the flaws in the bridge class had been identified, there were still the sentimental needs of those who had lost their loved ones aboard the ship, especially in the city of Liverpool, which was not only the ship's port of registry, but also the home of 17 of her crew, who had left behind wives and children desperate for answers, eventually resulting in the formation of the Derbyshire Families Association, or DFA, campaigning for a true account of the Derbyshire's loss. While the official investigation undertaken by the Department for Transport had ended in 1989, concluding that the Derbyshire had been lost to Typhoon Orchid due to its design flaws, in 1994 a deep-sea search, funded in part by the Seafarers Union, was undertaken, using the reported locations of the various oil slicks to try and pinpoint the ship's resting place. Covering an area of 75 square miles, Ocean Explorer 6000 side-scan sonar and Magellan 725 ROV systems from the survey vessel Shin Kai Mart began a scan of the ocean floor, until on June 3rd, at a depth of 3.5 miles below the surface, the colour monitor displaying the Ocean Explorer's sonar imagery revealed a scene of widespread and massive destruction, the obliterated remains of bulk carrier Derbyshire. The first expedition to the Derbyshire lasted only 8 days, but was followed by a longer expedition funded by the British government and the European Union that took 147,000 photographs and over 24 hours worth of video footage of the wreck site over the course of 44 days, and with it, was able to determine that the loss of the ship was both much more terrifying and violent than had previously been considered. Due to the use of a flush deck, rather than the fitting of a more conventional forecastle, towering waves caused by Typhoon Orchid were allowed to shear off the covers of small ventilation pipes near the bow, which, over the next 2 days, caused seawater to enter into the forward ballast section of the ship and draw the bow slowly into the water. As the bow continued to be dragged into the sea, the hatch on the No. 1 hold became exposed to the harsh elements, and with the hatches not designed to withstand direct impacts from surging waves, it was eventually broken loose, causing it to flood and drag the vessel further below the surface. With the ship being drawn downward, one hold after another was compromised, resulting in extreme pressures being placed on the hull both internally and externally, until it eventually buckled at multiple points along its length, causing the vessel to break apart and slip beneath the waves in less than 2 minutes, long before the crew could issue any kind of distress signal or man the lifeboats. While the causes to the sinking was finally determined in 2000, the Derbyshire was only one of 17 bulk carrier sinkings to occur in 1980 alone, most of which either went unreported or uninvestigated. Such was the danger of these vessels, either due to fundamental flaws or designs that weren't able to withstand the massive forces often exerted on their frames, that between 1980 and 1994, 149 bulk carriers and combination carriers were sunk, with the cumulative deaths of 1,144 lives. At the very least, closure was thankfully given to the crew of the Derbyshire, and to honour their loss, a memorial in the garden of the Church of Our Lady and St Nicholas in Liverpool was dedicated by Lord Prescott on September 15, 2018, organised by the Derbyshire Families Association, led by Chairman Paul Lambert, whose brother, 19-year-old seaman Peter Lambert, was among the crew of the ship on her final voyage. Today, while computer-assisted design and other new forms of construction methods allow for ships to be built with a lot more integrity, and have thus largely improved the safety of the shipping industry as a whole, one cannot forget the silent sacrifices made by the merchant seamen in order for these improvements to be made, the loss of the MV Derbyshire being possibly the greatest example of how avoidable mistakes left unaddressed ultimately doomed 44 souls to a watery grave. Thanks again for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, why not leave a like, and be sure to subscribe for more great content. Thank you very much, take care, and I'll see you next time.